Okay, so I think it's recording. I can trim it down a little bit at the beginning. But in any case, yeah, well, small class today, but thank you for being here. This is our fourth of five, so we're almost done. We'll be wrapping up next weekend. Um, and today we're going to be talking about a topic that is honestly way too big for one class, or for one session of one class, rather. Um, I think that I could run a whole class on the history of the Reformation and still probably not cover everything. So just bear in mind, we're going to be running through this quite fast, and glossing over a lot of detail and nuance, to kind of get to the eventual point that we're going here. But we're talking about roughly, sort of the end of the medieval period, the beginning of the Renaissance, and then into the 1600s. And we're talking about, sort of the Age of Enlightenment. We're going to be talking about sort of the impact that had on, Christianity in the West, and then the impact that all had on monasticism. But as we have with all of our other class sessions, let's start today by talking about sort of an overarching thematic, and that is apostolate. So does anybody in the room, and I know it's kind of hard to hide when the teacher's calling on you and there's only three other people, anybody have any guess as to what apostolate means?
I know what I think it is, but I don't think I really know.
Okay, well, give it your best shot and we'll kind of work from there.
Well, first of all, I didn't know it was one word. I thought you were an apostolate, like an article A and then postulate.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it was someone who was interested in professing vows.
Okay.
That's
Gotcha.
what I thought, but I never knew it.
Right. So you're thinking like the word postulant.
Oh, yeah.
That's the word you're thinking of. Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So it's not related to that, but think when you see the whole word together, right? What's the first part of it? Right? What does that sound like?
It sounds like apostle, an apostle.
Right.
Yeah.
I think of it as being someone who has like an assignment or a mission.
Right. Yeah, there you go. I think mission is really the key word here. And we've talked about apostolic religious orders before. We talk about religious orders that have a focus on a ministry to the world, on service. So more often than not, the word is used in general to describe a group's particular ministry of evangelization. So what the heck does that all mean? Well, let's break it down, right? Ministry and evangelization. So how would you suppose that those two things would relate to each other? What's a ministry, what's evangelization, and how do those two things combine to make an apostolate?
Well, is it deciding how you're going to evangelize?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel here. I think that's a fairly succinct way of putting it, right? In general, right, the idea is that it is a particular group's, calling to the world and what they are called to do in terms of their particular ministry and evangelization, right? Spreading the good news, spreading the gospel. And this isn't just, a monastic term, right? We could talk about the apostolate of the laity, right? Where do you suppose that might come from? Well, think about your baptismal covenant. We've talked about this before in the context of a rule of life, right? The rule of life isn't exclusionary, it's not just a monastic thing, but anyone could have a rule of life that they follow. And the same with an apostolate, in the sense that, each of the distinct groups within the church, right? There's folks who are ordained, there are folks who are laity, and there are folks within those who are ordained who are called to be deacons, to be priests, and those who are called to be bishops, right? So within each of those different orders, within each of those different groups, there's a different ministry, right? So what are you called to do as the laity? you're called to proclaim the gospel at all times, right? And to, through your life and example and whatever means possible, to proclaim the good news, right? The clergy, same sort of thing, right? What do clergy vow themselves to when they are ordained, right? Either to the diaconate or to the priesthood, right? Administer the sacraments, to faithfully live their lives, in accordance with, the doctrine and discipline of the church, to model that behavior, in their lives. If they are to have children, to raise them in, a Christian manner, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about monastic communities, it's very much so the same thing. And we've talked about vows already, right? So, poverty, chastity, obedience, or with honor, power, fellowship, simplicity, fidelity, and obedience. But apostolate goes beyond just the vows themselves, and it describes the specific things, right? The specific things that members of an order are called to do, right? So each community has its own particular mission to the world, and this is something that comes through in the community's founding, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but think about, figures like Francis of Assisi, St. Benedict, Augustine, all of these figures who are founders of monastic orders, they had particular life experiences, right? And a particular path of discernment that led them to founding the order. But that particular path had different characteristics to it, and a different character and flavor to it. And so each of the orders came out different, right? If all monastic communities were the same, right, came from the same roots, there wouldn't be such variety. So again, using Ahamkara Fellowship as an example, the apostolate of Ahamkara Fellowship is in 3 parts: catechesis, spiritual direction, and chaplaincy. So within the context of our order, right, what that implies is that, our members don't have to, it's not like you have to work full-time as a hospital chaplain and that has to be your job, or full-time as a spiritual director and that has to be your job. But what it does mean is that we're called to those particular forms of ministry as a means of evangelization because our foundresses, right, discerned that these were the 3 things that this order was, called by the Spirit, called by God to do. You can even think, to be honest, of me running this class, right, as an exercise in, our apostolate in the form of catechesis, right? It's teaching of the faith. So that's sort of our high-level overview. And we'll get into this a little bit more on the nitty-gritty when we start talking about particularly the Jesuits and missionary work. But, for the time being, think back on the figures that we've talked about in the class so far and try to figure out, what, St. Dominic's apostolate was, what St. Francis's apostolate was, and so on and so forth. And we'll come back to this at the end. So let's just dive right in. I have no idea why that is that way on the screen. So we're going to just ignore that and continue going. So what was the Reformation? Well, again, we don't really have the time to go over it in anything more than just a bullet point or 2. But in essence, the way I define it here is a 16th century political and religious challenge to papal authority, right? You probably know a little bit about the Reformation, at least sort of in a, maybe your high school or college education, or just sort of in a pop history kind of way, right? Martin Luther, 95 Theses, Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, Pope wouldn't let him do it, sale of indulgences, things like that, right? So those are all part of the story. But it was sort of a broader, collection of grievances, reform movements that were, again, both political and religious in nature. It wasn't all theological, but predominantly in reference to the authority of the Pope and, those Catholic princes, emperors, kings, and whatnot who, in terms of whether their authority was subservient to the popes or on par with the popes, right? And so, as I said just a little bit ago, right, the Reformation in general is characterized by change and reform ideals, right? So it really is a child of the Enlightenment. When we say the Enlightenment, we're talking about sort of the period during the Renaissance in which science and logical thinking and sort of all of these new ways of understanding the world, the scientific revolution, right, came into being. And those, society-wide changes in thinking really influenced every level and permeated every level of society, including religion, right? And so you had a lot of Reformation thinkers and theologians who started to think about religion differently in the context of these broader societal changes that were going on around them. But, it's also, I think, important to recognize that, yes, this increased focus on science and rationalism was going on at the time, but the idea of, people being dissatisfied with something and wanting to change it is as old as humanity itself, right? And so there is sort of a through point and a link to some of these other theological reform movements that we've talked about within monasticism up to this point. So, think about last week when we talked about the Cistercians and the Premonstratensians, right? Two different groups who broke away from the Benedictines because they had serious grievances with the way that their communities were operating, felt that they were lax morally, lax spiritually, whatever, way you want to put it. And, these reforms and this reform approach to Benedictine monasticism was something that was going on in the 13 and 1400s, right? A couple centuries before the start of the Reformation. So there is a trend and a precedent for that kind of thinking, within history at this period. But one of the other things that sort of comes out of the Reformation that's important to this class particularly is the focus on rational thought, scientific method, that sort of thing, in opposition to what thinkers at the time would call superstition or idolatry. And as such, monasticism became a target for both those who were, purporting the theological side and working on the theological side of the Reformation, as well as for, princes and rulers who adopted the Reformation. So, it's important, I think, to note, right, that some of the things that happened to, during the context of the Reformation were theological, but a lot of them were also politically motivated, just as, the Anglo-Saxon rulers adopted Christianity, sometimes out of sincere conversion and faith, but other times just as a means of getting, political clout or, having some sort of advantage politically. So too did some rulers during the era of the Reformation adopt Protestantism in its various flavors as a matter of politics, right? So, the overall take out of all of this that I want you all to have is that, again, the Reformation is a really huge topic, and it's one that we could absolutely do another class on, and that I will not adequately cover right here. And then as we start talking about the English Reformation in just a second. And, I think the other sort of caveat here that's important is to recognize that there's a lot of, nastiness within history, right? that doesn't imply that there's necessarily a value judgment to it, and I want to be very clear as we move forward. None of the way that I'm trying to present this is in any way trying to either support or, bash Protestantism and, on the whole, right? That said, we're going to be talking about basically the English crown's move to dissolve monastic houses in England, Wales, and Ireland during the reign of Henry VIII. And for the most part, monasticism basically went away in the British Isles until, what it would be about the 1800s, I think. So you have a couple of hundreds of years where there just wasn't monasticism. And a lot of the motivation for, sort of shutting down monastic houses, some of it was theological, some of it was political. So, it is sort of a nasty part of history to a certain extent. But it's also, I think, important to be honest about history and our history as Anglicans, right? And, being part of the Anglican communion and understanding what that means for us. I think there's a lot of throwing the baby out with the bathwater that happens both, with discussing these sorts of issues, right? And it's very easy to say, well, this happened and it shouldn't have happened, and so all of this is bad, right? So I just want us to keep that in mind as we kind of move forward and start touching on this. But that said, I'm going to take a little sip of my tea here. That said, let's sort of dive in here. Again, this isn't going to be an overview really of what the English Reformation was or how it was distinct from, let's say Calvinism or Lutheranism, whatever, sort of other branches of Protestantism that evolved, but more so an overview of the English Reformation as it pertains to monasticism. But the English Reformation sort of on the whole, right, as we had sort of mentioned earlier, it's more complex than just Henry VIII wanted a divorce, the Pope said no, so he founded his own church, right? And there's a few things of note here. So yes, his divorce from Catherine of Aragon was part of the story, right? The King of England requested the Pope that he be allowed to divorce his wife. The Pope didn't allow it. But it's also important to recognize that there were Reformation thinkers and theologians in England prior to this, right? There were people in England at the time and beforehand who were trying to reform, English Catholicism in line with Martin Luther's movement, right? Martin Luther publishes his 95 Theses. Oh, goodness, I want to say 1515. I might be wrong on the date there, but, early part of the 1500s. He isn't officially sanctioned, I don't think, until the Council of Worms, which is, I think, in 1527. I might be wrong on that date too, but it was about a decade and a half. And all the while, right, the printing press and the availability of literature, widely produced, allowed these ideas to spread very rapidly. And so it was only a matter of time before people in England were starting to say, maybe this Martin Luther guy has, something to say that's important. One other thing I wanted to note, I think it's important to sort of look at the context, right? And sometimes one word makes a difference. So when we talk about the way that Henry understood what he was doing, right, in terms of splitting with papal authority, the way that he styled himself was as the king or the head of the church in England, not of England, right? We talk about, the COE, the Church of England today, right? At the time, the idea was very much more so and we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the Celtic Church, right? This idea of there being sort of a separate entity in, within the British Isles, but that its history is separate, that its foundations are separate. And we talked about a little bit of why that was untrue a couple of classes ago. However, Henry's idea wasn't necessarily to completely split with Rome. Simply, it was a question of authority. And remember, we talked about the politics of the Reformation just a little bit ago. Some princes and rulers made decisions of which side they were going to support as a matter of, politics. And whether or not you were going to submit to the authority of the Pope or not played a part in that. So, that's sort of a bit of an aside here, but I think it's an important one to make. Another thing, which we talked about just a little bit ago, right, was this sort of push against superstition, idolatry, as a matter of sort of rational Enlightenment thinking. So, right, rooted in the Enlightenment. This also could serve as a convenient means to an end, right? If you could, claim that a certain group of people were superstitious, idolatrous, whatever the case may be, you could enact political change in order to, using that as a justification, right? So essentially, right, you could say monasticism, right, with its relics and its chanting and, Mass in Latin and daily office and all that sort of, divine office, all that sort of thing, right, is this superstitious, idolatrous, thing of the past. And the people who are there at the monasteries and running the monasteries are, all complicit in that behavior and are as such morally lax. And that could be, and in fact was, not just in England, but across Europe, used as a justification for closing monastic houses. Now, there is also the other plainly stated reality, which is that Henry was in debt and needed money, right? And his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, who was a proponent of, the English Reformation, saw that as an opportunity to accomplish a theological goal for him while accomplishing a, practical financial goal on the part of the king, right? So what actually happened under the rule of Henry VIII? So under the direction of the king and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, between 1535 and 1540, all, and I mean all, monastic houses in England, Wales, and Ireland were permanently closed. Now, what does that actually mean? So, as I said just a little bit ago, right, there were various reasons, political, financial, theological, to it. And in terms of, again, the justification, right, it kind of comes in two stages. Henry ordered the production of the Valor Ecclesiasticus, right, a document basically, looking at the financial worth of the various monastic houses across the realm. After collecting that data, he then ordered the production of the Compendium Compertorum, the Book of Findings. And what this essentially did was, sort of along the lines of, as I was talking about in the previous slide, right? If you could say monastics were lax morally, you could use that as a pretext for closing the monastic houses and confiscating their property. So this book, were you saying something, Barbara?
No, sorry.
Oh, okay. I just saw you light up there. I wasn't sure if you had a question. So this compendium, right, it listed a number of things. It listed names of those who committed offenses against chastity, those who wanted to be released from their vows, the so-termed superstition of the house, which in essence meant how many relics they had, the name of the founder, or more practically the founder's heir, assumed to be the patron of the house because it provided them with spiritual benefits, and then the incomes and debts of each house. Now, I think it's important too to note here that scholars, as with really anything, it's not just a black and white kind of thing. There's more nuance to it. So scholars acknowledge that this piece has sort of a propaganda bent to it, right? There's a clear sort of, the crown wants this, we're going to produce this document to get this result. However, scholars also acknowledge that the document can't just be written off sort of on claims of being propaganda, and that there may be, to a certain extent, some legitimacy to its findings, right? We have to remember at this time, one of the main sort of drivers behind the Protestant Reformation in general was the accusation of, financial impropriety, rampant abuse of, office by both monastics and clergy and bishops, and so there is basis for the claims that are being made to a certain degree. So you have to sort of weigh those two things against each other in terms of understanding what the purpose of the document was, and how much of reality it actually reflects. But in any case, that being said, the crown, out of sort of these two documents, made the decision to dissolve the monasteries and established what they called the Court of Augmentations, which oversaw the dissolution of the monasteries, dispatching agents to each individual shire across the kingdom and, seeing to their closing. But they also essentially served as a pension network for ex-monastics who weren't just kicked out of the monasteries, but they were pensioned, right? And we'll get into that in the next slide a little bit to talk about sort of the flip side of this, because this all sounds really bad to this point, but it wasn't entirely, a heartless, ruthless kind of thing. Some groups did resist, but many of them, in fact, the majority of them, handed themselves over to the crown voluntarily. And in fact, there were even some monastics and some houses who had Protestant sympathies and were content with the decision to dissolve the monasteries. As we said when we were talking about the compendium, right, it counted those who wished to be released from their vows. And I don't actually have exact numbers on what the percentage of them were, but there were some who did want to be released from their vows, right? So in total, right, the closing of the monasteries was completed in two stages, by two separate acts of parliament. The first closed the small houses worth less than £200, and the latter, the large houses, of which I think the way that I have sort of come to understand is that the larger houses were the ones that were more likely to go voluntarily, in part because there was the precedent set by the closing of the smaller ones and they had more time to prepare. One other thing I think of note is, talking about who benefited from this. And we'll talk about this a little bit in terms of sort of how people adjusted to life after the monastery for those who were part of monastic communities in England at the time. But one example I have here, and we actually didn't talk about this in our last class because there just wasn't time for it, but that being the military orders of monastics, the Hospitallers and the Templar Knights and the Teutonic Order and those sorts of things. But one of the people who actually benefited from the dissolution of the monasteries was the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, who was made a Viscount and was given all of the Hospitaller lands in Ireland and a annual pension for his cooperation in basically shutting down the order in Ireland. And so he sort of went from being the Grand Master of a monastic order to being a landed noble. So there's a lot of, I suppose, self-serving reasons that some people went along with this. There's also a lot of not self-serving reasons people went along with it. But in any case, I love political cartoons. And so I've got a fun little political cartoon that I found here. And I'm curious, this is one of the things I always love doing in classes. Tell me what you see here.
I see a fat King Henry and an equally chubby monk.
Sort of a Friar Tuck looking
guy. Yeah. So they, which sort of implies that they're maybe, like make wealth, prosperity, overindulgence on both sides. And,
right.
and it looks like the monk is holding onto a candlestick and a, like trying to run away with all the precious stuff before Henry gets a hold of it.
Right.
That's what I see. And cute little dogs.
Yes.
Who's that clergyman beside Henry?
I believe that is Kramer.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure, but that,
Cromwell?
I'm sorry, Cromwell.
Yeah.
Yes, Thomas Cromwell.
He's riding, it looks like a donkey or
he is.
Yeah, he is.
And what do you suppose the donkey that he's riding versus the the stallions that the king and all of his other retainers are riding might imply?
The king is enriching himself.
Right. It's clearly it's a fox hunt, right? They've got the dogs. They've got, the guy in the back looks like he's ready for playing polo. And the king has his little shepherd's crook thing in his hand. So it's definitely, I think, portraying Henry in that light. But I think also, right, the Friar Tuck-esque monk, right, that in and of itself is sort of a stereotype. And it's the fat monk running away with all of his wealth.
His gold, his loot.
Right. So I think the painting to a certain extent is a commentary against both sides, right? Which I think is probably more historically correct in terms of the way of looking at it, that, a lot of these monastic houses were really concerned with enriching themselves, and their members weren't living according to their vows, and their abbots or grand masters or whatever you might be talking about were essentially nobility, right, and lived as such. And so sort of the monk running away is this image of attempting to hoard that wealth, while at the same time you have this very unflattering portrayal of Henry VIII as sort of going on this fox hunt and trying to hunt down the monk. So I thought it was a really interesting kind of picture to throw in here and sort of show those complexities. But in any case, as I've said before, right, the overall picture of this does appear to be very brutal to a certain extent. But one of the things that sort of shapes our modern understanding of this period comes from the 19th century Anglo-Catholic reformers and, folks who wanted to, at a time in the church, who wanted to bring back monasticism to the Anglican Church, who wanted to shift to a more Anglo-Catholic as compared to Protestant approach within the church, and looked back at this period, right, as having been a mistake, right, for monasteries to have been dissolved. And so that tells you to a certain extent, right, I think it's always important to keep in mind who's telling you what and what your sources come from and what biases they might have when you're trying to sort of pick apart history. But yeah, so those attempting to restore monasticism to the Anglican Church. There's a few other things to consider, one of which I mentioned in the last slide, but all of the ex-monastics were pensioned, right? It wasn't a question of the crown coming in, confiscating their land and property and kicking them out on the streets. They were all given a pension, which was dependent in part on the financial assessment of the communities that was made. And then also in part upon your status within the community. And the higher up you were, the more a pension that you got. This did sort of leave basically all of the women sort of, to get thrown under the bus, as it were, in the sense that nunneries were usually worth less than, had less in terms of total worth than, monastic houses did. And so a lot of the women weren't able to, receive a pension that was nearly as much as their male counterparts. The other interesting thing is that, I think I say it in the next bullet point here, but a lot of the male monastics transitioned either into the life of clergy, they were ordained, or became preachers, right? Protestant Anglican preachers. And so those were sort of job opportunities that were available to males that weren't available to, to women at the time. For the first, I think, about decade after the dissolution of the monasteries, the monastics or ex-monastics were allowed to be, relieved of their vows of poverty and obedience, but not of chastity. So they weren't allowed to marry. And that created some legal trouble and issues with, some of them who did marry anyway, and now what? Do they need to get remarried, and are there consequences to that? But eventually, they would sort of change course and allow the ex-monastics to marry, which, at least for the women, gave them certain opportunities that they didn't have before. A lot of the women who left the nunneries ended up moving back home with family because they couldn't afford to support themselves. Some of these transitions were even made before the monasteries were dissolved, right? And we talked about, briefly just the larger houses in the second wave of reforms or dissolutions, which, they had time to prepare for, right? And so a lot of these people who, were living there saw the writing on the wall and decided to, begin making a transition to a life outside of the monastery before it was closed. So by 1549, so about a decade later, a lot of the monastics were allowed legally then to marry, and many of whom did. A survey conducted in 1556 found that actually almost 20% of them had, over 15 years later, married. One of the, not in England, but Martin Luther actually ended up marrying a former nun. They had a family together and actually lived in the monastery that Martin Luther had been at. Remember, he was an Augustinian canon. And they ended up living there after the monastery was closed. So I've got two more quick pictures here just because I know the last couple of slides have been very text heavy. And so I wanted to kind of break this up a little bit. The one on the left is Henry VIII, enthroned in his royal, sort of garb, regalia. But who do you suppose all the folks around him are?
Well, some of them are, either priests or monks because they have head coverings. But then are the men on the right hand side supposed to be like politicians or secular people?
Well, so it's interesting. I appreciate the head coverings pointing that out, right? You see some of them have the little skull caps on. The understanding that I have, and I might be wrong about this, but I believe the individuals who have sort of the red sashes on are all bishops.
Oh.
And so the picture is sort of depicting the, sort of the allegiance of the bishops, not to the Pope, but to Henry as king, right?
Oh, yeah.
So
That makes
sort of
sense.
that's sort of the point of that one. The one on the right, which is unfortunately blurrier than I thought it was going to be, but this is a picture from the, a picture as if it was taken on the battlefield. This is a painting of, I don't know which battle, but it's one of the battles during the European Wars of Religion. And we're not at all going to get into this, but I think it was just sort of an interesting side to point out that after the period of the Reformation, there was about 80 or so year period of basically constant warfare across Europe between those, principalities and kingdoms and whatnot who chose to become Protestant and those who remained Catholic. And so here, the men there and with the pikes and all of that, they're Spanish actually. And so this is, the Spanish and the French, along with a lot of the German states, took part in these wars of religion. So in any case, shifting, I guess, from England for a second and talking about the rest of Europe, what was the state of monasticism everywhere else? Well, it was fairly similar to that in England, right? It varied from state to state, obviously depending on which one was Catholic or Protestant. But in almost every part of Europe where Protestantism was successful, monasteries were closed, suppressed, dissolved, sold, or disbanded, and abandoned. Now, there are some exceptions to this. A lot of the social services that monastic houses ran, poorhouses, soup kitchens, those sorts of things, ended up being secularized in a lot of places. And so they were transferred to local municipalities. But one of the unfortunate side effects of this was that most of those sorts of services used to be open to anyone. And when they were transferred to municipal control, a lot of them became available for residents of that municipality only. And so a lot of people who had relied on those services weren't able to access them anymore. It is, I think, important to note as well that there were a few, not many, but a few monastic groups, monastic houses that survived the Reformation. And I don't know why the formatting of that is weird, but we're going to ignore it. So there were also some Catholic monasteries, particularly those in rural areas that sort of were outside of the influence of the city and sort of the heart of what the Reformation was. The Reformation was a very urban sort of thing. But there were some Catholic monasteries that continued to exist in Protestant, now Protestant nations. But there also were some Protestant monasteries. There were two particularly that still exist actually to this day in modern day Germany. I'm not going to try to pronounce those. But they both survived the Reformation by adopting Lutheranism. And in our last class next week, we'll talk about sort of the revival of monasticism within different Protestant traditions. There are Lutheran monastics today, just as there are Anglican and Episcopal monastics. There are, most of those groups were founded in the 18 or 1900s, as is the case in the Anglican communion, right? So within at least the Anglican tradition, there weren't any that really survived the Reformation. Within German and other sort of continental traditions, there were some that did, but most of them, again, were dissolved and then refounded, in the 18 and 1900s. So we're going to take a little bit of a turn here and stop talking about the Reformation and start talking about the Counter-Reformation, because the Counter-Reformation was the Catholic response to the Reformation, and I see that my picture didn't load, and I'm annoyed by that, but in any case, the Catholic response to the Reformation was also rooted in Enlightenment ideals, right? There was a recognition within the Catholic Church that there were abuses, right? That there were issues. And the Counter-Reformation sought to reconcile, right, to as I say in this next bullet point here, uphold and reaffirm the structures and teachings of the medieval church, while also at the same time admitting the need for reform. Those including more focus on the parish, and better education for parish priests, especially those in rural areas. There were a lot of Catholic priests at the time in very rural areas who didn't really have a good theological education, who, again, at the time, Mass was said in Latin, and so some of them couldn't even speak or read Latin. And so the Catholic Church tried to remedy that. They tried to crack down on financial impropriety, and specifically the sale of indulgences, and attempted to stop the practice of absentee bishops or hereditary bishoprics. And so there was a lot of bishops who sort of ran their bishopric as a feudal holding, collected rents from it, and lived in Rome, let's say, and they had a bishopric somewhere in southern Germany. And the idea was to, sort of reverse that and make it so that bishops were required to live, in their diocese, full time. So there are two main groups. We're going to talk about the Trappists first, just briefly, and then talk about the Jesuits, and that'll sort of wrap things up. But there were two main religious orders that came out of the Counter-Reformation that I wanted to touch on here. So the Trappists, and we've mentioned them before, right? You think of beer making or cheese making or whatever. Trappists are sort of in this long line of Benedictine reform movements. So if you recall, the Cistercians were a breakaway movement from the Benedictines. And just as the Cistercians were a breakaway movement, the Trappists were a breakaway movement from the Cistercians. So it's sort of this chain. And very similarly to the Cistercians themselves, originally, the Trappists held the view that were you saying something, Marianne?
No.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I'm focusing on the Von Trapp family singers, so I'm trying to. So I'm staying focused. Here we go.
Awesome. So, so the Trappists were, focused on austerity, on a lack of, perceived lack of strictness, right? So they originated in the, I don't think I actually have a date on here, which is an oversight, but in any case, early 1600s, I think 1620s, as a distinct reform movement from, stemming from the Cistercian abbot Armand Jean Le Bourthonnier de Rance. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but that is my best attempt at it. Technically, they're the order of Reformed Cistercians of Our Lady of La Trappe, which are called Trappists after the abbey at which they were, which the same thing with the Cistercians being named after a region, right? They were technically not actually recognized as a distinct order until 1892. They sort of operated internally within the Cistercians until they finally, were recognized as a distinct thing. And again, sought a more strict interpretation of the Benedictine rule, right? A greater focus on manual labor, even than their Cistercian brethren, both as a penitential act and as well as becoming self-supportive, not being so reliant on financial donations or patrons to support them. And again, cutting down on that sort of, the possibility for impropriety and for, what's the word I'm looking for? For people exploiting, something that should be focused on God, prayer, that sort of thing, and using it for their own financial gain, right? So again, we think about Cistercians, Trappists, right, making beer, making cheese, those sorts of things. And so, owing, again, we talked about, I think in our first class, Pachomius, right, and supporting themselves by weaving baskets and things like that. So it's continuing on a long monastic tradition of manual labor and production, but just sort of ramping it up in response to the times and in response to what was going on at the time. So our last little section here, we're going to talk briefly about the Jesuits, because within at least the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits were probably the preeminent order, and it really has to do with timing, right? In terms of the Jesuits being founded right at the point in time at which the Reformation is kicking off, and subsequently as a result of that being very crucial in the response to the Reformation. So as we've done before, we're going to talk about at the beginning, right, the founder of the particular order. And in this case, it's Ignatius of Loyola. So surprise, surprise, another military man turned monastic. Ignatius was, you might know the story, famously injured at the Battle of Pamplona, 1521. He had a cannonball basically explode his leg. And he spent over a year recovering, right? This is an era before anesthesia, before really modern surgery. They had to break and reset his leg multiple times. And the end result of that was that his one leg, I forget if it was the right or the left, but was shorter than the other. And so he ended up with a limp the rest of his life. But while he was basically spending that year cooped up in bed, he had 2 books to read, both of which were religious texts that his sister sent to him. And these, reading them over and over and over again, led to his conversion. I think the story goes, one of them was the Lives of the Saints, and he sort of, in reading that, felt more fulfilled and sort of enthralled by the idea of the lives of the saints than he ever had in his glorious sort of aspiration to live a glorious military life. And so that was sort of his first step in discernment of realizing that he was not called to be a military man. And so as part of that, right, he had a desire to follow the example by, set by other great monastics, in particular Francis of Assisi. And so once he had recovered to the point where he could walk, he went out, sold his possessions, very similar sort of to a lot of the other monastic founders that we've read about or talked about here in this class. He lived an ascetic life for a while, lived in a cave for a while. And the cave is located in the vicinity of Manresa, in Spain. And that's, if you hear about like a Jesuit retreat house, called Manresa, there's multiple ones. That's where the name comes from. He spent some time as a pilgrim in the Holy Land. He actually went with the Franciscans, and then they ended up sending him back home just because things were heating up in the Holy Land at that time, and it was dangerous for pilgrims. And he would eventually go on to receive his master's degree. He would study in Paris and study theology and be licensed to preach. And all these experiences, but particularly his time spent as an ascetic and in the cave, he was working on what would later be published as the spiritual exercises. Some of you might have heard of the spiritual exercises, right? It's something that a lot of retreats use or use parts of. But Ignatius's intent essentially was to focus one's understanding on, focus on one's understanding of both God and self, right? Through intense daily prayer, meditation, and guided retreat through, using a spiritual director. And an overall sort of wholesale conversion of heart. And it's important to note, right, that that's, again, in the midst of the Reformation. And so the Jesuits, sort of armed with the spiritual exercises, became very much so the front line of attempting to reconvert people back to Catholicism during this period. So the Jesuits themselves, right? 7 companions founded the order in 1534. So you think about the time period and what's lining up, right? That's the year before the first dissolution of the monasteries in England, right? So we're right here time-wise with all of these other events of the Reformation going on. So Ignatius, Francis Xavier, and Peter Faber are probably the 3 most well-known of the original 7. They're more properly known as the Society of Jesus. And their foundational documents reflect both Ignatius's military background as well as the Counter-Reformation era of its founding. So these are some quotes from their foundational documents, right? Whosoever desires to serve as a soldier of God beneath the banner of the cross, right? It's very military kind of styling to it. But this other quote I thought was very relevant to our discussion of apostolate. And so Ignatius writes of the order, right, and its members, to strive especially for the defense and propagation of the faith and for the progress of souls in Christian life and doctrine by means of public preaching, lectures, and any other ministration whatsoever in the Word of God, and further by means of retreats, the education of children and unlearned persons in Christianity, and the spiritual consolation of Christ's faithful through hearing confessions and administering the other sacraments. So, we'll come back to this in just a bit when we get to apostolate at the end, but just think about that for a second and kind of keep that churning in your head here. So we have two more slides. We're going to try to get through them quick here, so now we're getting up to our hour. And I wanted to talk about sort of the impact of particularly the Jesuits, but the spread of Christianity globally. Because one of the other things going on at this period, as you might think about, right, is this era of early exploration and colonization, right? Think Columbus, 1492, and after that point, sort of the race is on for European powers to get a foothold in the Americas, right? And so you have the Spanish and Portuguese primarily in South and Central America and in the Caribbean, the French and English primarily in North America, as well as exploration and trade around, the Cape in South Africa with India, China, the East Indies, Japan. But the Jesuits were really a huge part of this, right? And sort of that monastic tradition of preaching, teaching, and education really served them well in that respect and sort of positioned them as the forefront of Christian missionary work. It's also interesting to note that sometimes that came into conflict with the colonial authorities. In fact, the Jesuits and other monastic orders were sometimes the only force standing between the natives and outright slavery, in terms of sort of abating the desires of the colonial authorities. So in terms of just this meteoric growth of the Jesuit order as well as their spread globally, by 1603, there were 345 Jesuit priests in Mexico alone, right? We might think here in the Great Lakes region, right, of the French regions in Canada, the Great Lakes, Jacques Gravier and Pierre Marquette, right, figure into this history in terms of I think the picture on the left is Pierre Marquette, preaching from a canoe here. Asia is a little bit of a different story. Christianity was very rapidly and widely accepted across the Americas, particularly in Latin America, but less so in Asia. And the Jesuits in particular found the most success in the Philippines, as well as Portuguese India, but not so much in China and Japan. Francis Xavier, one of the original 7, traveled to Goa, which is on the west coast of India, and then later to China, where he would die in 1552. But they would continue, the Jesuits, with their ministry of education by founding various colleges. So St. Paul's College in Macau, for instance, on the south coast of China. And by 1608, right, roughly the same period at which there were 365 priests in Mexico, there were already 15 Jesuit schools in Goa alone, right? So again, that focused on education and ministry, led to the order spreading across the world as explorers made contact with and settled in and colonized these various areas. One other thing that I wanted to mention as well, just briefly here, that I know I said in a previous class that I would talk about, we talked about the Jesuits in terms of learning, education, spiritual exercises, and confessions. And one of the things that kind of came along with this was, in the era of the printing press, right, the ability to publish, produce, and distribute the spiritual exercises as well as various confession manuals, which a lot of Jesuits would carry with them, as they traveled and, conducted their missionary work. And in fact, these would be sort of updated eventually and sort of tailored to, you would have confession manuals tailored to a particular geographic region, right, within, New Mexico, or within, Portuguese India, right, or the Philippines, right, tailored to those particular people, in terms of, taking those experiences, bringing them back home, digesting them, and then churning them out again. It's also interesting to note as well that the Jesuits were very focused on language and native languages, and took a lot of pains to learn and translate native languages, and would then publish these confession manuals and whatnot in those languages, right? So, wrapping up, apostolate, right? After everything we've talked about, what is an apostolate? And maybe can you give me an example of an apostolate from the Jesuits, let's say, that we talked about today?
Well, Jesuits are famous for being teachers.
Yeah, absolutely.
To a retreat once led by a Jesuit priest, and I'm a recovering alcoholic, and as was he. And it was a 12-step retreat.
Right.
And so ironically, the reading for that day was when Jesus changes water into wine. So we all got a chuckle out of that. And then he said, furthermore, he used to teach math. So he said, we really have tried to calculate how many gallons of wine that must have been, because they were huge containers, that had
right
to immerse themselves in. So that was pretty funny.
That is funny.
Besides education, I think of them as really fierce advocates for the faith.
Right.
So, like strong founders of education, but then these fierce, like, you don't mess with the Jesuits.
Mm-hmm.
My image. That's my image.
Yeah, they definitely have built that reputation. And again, I think it owes to that military foundation of the order, the two sort of phrases that are associated with the Jesuits, Ad majorem Dei gloriam, right, for the greater glory of God, is sort of the more well-known one. And the other one, I'm forgetting the Latin of it, but basically it's as a corpse, which is to say the ideal Jesuit is one who is as disciplined as a corpse is, right? In the sense of, right, corpses don't move. So, it's fascinating, that sort of military order structure, absolute obedience. One of the other interesting things too is that the Jesuits take 4 vows, being the 3 traditional: poverty, chastity, obedience, but the 4th being a special vow of obedience directly to the Pope. And so that sort of got them both a reputation as sort of being the Pope's enforcers to a certain extent. And again, during this era of Counter-Reformation, they were very much so involved in, preaching against Protestantism at the time in Europe. But the second interesting thing is it sort of got them in a bit of hot water later on, because at a certain point, the Jesuits were actually disbanded by the Pope as a matter of, that's a story for another time. But in any case, they got into some hot water with the papacy, got disbanded, and then were later reinstated. But yeah, I think both of those points are really, really good here in terms of apostolate, right? What's their mission to the world? Education, preaching, right? Enforcing the faith, being very doctrinally and educationally sound, theologically sound.
I think I was at a retreat, another retreat. This is when I lived in New Mexico. And there was a gentleman and his wife who kind of spent their whole summer in their RV going around from, retreat center to retreat center at different monasteries. And so one evening we were talking, and he was no longer a priest, obviously, he was married. But he said he had been both a Jesuit and a Marine, and there was no difference.
That's
cool. Very funny.
Very true. What
right.
What you're saying, that
right.
you got to be tough to be a Jesuit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we kind of talked about this a little bit already, right? The focus on teaching, education, and preaching as being the sort of foundational things for Jesuits, particularly in terms of their missionary work. And I know last time we talked about the Dominicans, right? And we talked about the Dominicans as teachers. The distinction between the two is that the Dominicans taught at schools, but didn't really found schools, right? And certainly there are Dominican schools today, but the Jesuits were really one of the first monastic orders who, as part of their apostolate, were very committed to education and founding of universities. That, I went to a Jesuit school, right? Went to a Jesuit college for undergrad. And, there's a very high focus placed on classical education, on a humanities education, right? Learning philosophy, learning theology, learning literature, those sorts of things. And that was something that really was valued from the beginning. And I think owes to Ignatius' experience of, of attending, of going to university in Paris, right, and receiving a similar sort of classical education at the time. So, excuse me. And in terms of the missionary work, right, this is at a period where Christianity is spreading across the globe. And so it makes sense that the Jesuits would, being founded at that point in time, be very involved in that, right, and on the front lines of missionary work in the East Indies and China and Japan. I don't know why, but I don't have my last slide on here. I'm sorry the slideshow has been such a mess today. I was trying to work on it while we were camping, and that was probably not the best idea.
Probably not.
But in any case, that's all I have for you today. So as I would normally have here, if you have any questions, now's the time for them. And if not, or if you do, in any case, we'll be meeting again next Sunday, same time, same place, same Zoom link. And it'll be November then, and that'll be our last session. We'll wrap up next week.
And it will be a time change.
There'll be a time change, right?
Yeah. Well, Kevin, this was really interesting, and it touched on more of the history. Well, I taught AP Euro history, so it's where I'm at. But I have a question. Two things. First of all, did the Jesuits found all the missions along the coast of California? Were those Jesuit missions?
So a lot of those were Franciscan.
Okay, okay. And then is the current Pope a Jesuit?
Yeah, he's the first Jesuit Pope. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Is he the only Pope that's been a Jesuit?
Yes, the first and only. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I interrupted you there.
Oh no, of course.
No,
all right.
All right, I have two questions.
Sure.
First of all, and back to Henry VIII, and you said either you said or implied that he closed the monasteries for financial reasons.
Right.
Why was he in financial difficulty?
So the understanding that I have of it is that Henry sort of thought of himself as a warrior king, right? And if you know anything about Henry, in his youth, he was, he liked to joust, he liked to, to don his armor, and he was just, I guess for lack of a better term, he was sort of a stud, right? And he wanted to have glory on the battlefield. And so he ended up going to war with France and took out a lot of money in loans to do so. And the war went terribly. One thing to keep in mind about the way that sort of war worked in this time period is that you would oftentimes, in order to finance a war, take out loans, either from dedicated bankers or loans from nobility. And the idea was that you would repay those loans with the spoils of war, right? If you won and you got all the booty that you would get from winning, both in terms of goods and valuable items, taken from captured towns or castles or whatnot, or land, right? And then that would be used to pay back the debt. The problem, of course, with that is that if you lose, you go into debt and now you have no way of repaying. So that essentially is sort of the long story short of that.
Okay.
And so he ended up in a lot of debt as a result of that. And it wasn't the only reason, but it was the main reason, I think, in terms of at least the financials of it. Okay. And so he used a lot of the money from the sales of the monastery property. Obviously, some of it went into those pension funds for ex-monastics, but he used a lot of that to pay debt and to pay back nobles who he basically owed, a favor, right, for whatever support they had given him militarily.
Okay.
Did you have another question, though, Rich?
I'll let it go for another time because time's getting short.
Fair enough.
Okay.
All righty. Well, thank you all very much for being here. I'm gonna stop the recording. So let me just do that right now. Let's stop share. I don't know if it stopped recording.